And now it's time for Mob Talk Radio with your host, Jeff Canarsie.
Welcome to Mob Talk Radio. I'm your host, Jeff Canarsie, and I hope everybody's Thanksgiving was good. No real complaints from my end. Got some personal stuff going on, but I'm not going to get into that. But I wanted to address a couple of things because we have two big shows today. The first show we're going to do is Joe Bonanno. I'm going to go into little details before I start that show because there's a couple things I want to say about that. And then we're going to cover Joey Messino, which is going to be a really big show. Only because there's so much that went on with Joey Messino. You probably would think that Joe Bonanno would be bigger, but he really wasn't in terms of the information and stuff like that I'm going to present today. As far as the questions, you guys are killing me on Twitter and Facebook and everything else. I don't mind the questions, but it's all hours of the night, and I'm still trying to catch up. There's like 300 or 400 I still got to get to. But like I said, as far as that goes, you can definitely reach me at Real Mob Talk 7 on Twitter, Facebook, Mob Talk Radio. Just type it in the search bar and you'll find us. Like us, subscribe, send your death threats, your complaints, the usual. But yeah, definitely, we're probably going to be doing another Q&A soon. Not sure when. We'll figure that out. It's just after the holidays. That's why I'm doing two shows. We may take a break next week. I haven't decided as of yet. Anyhow, with today's show about Joe Bonanno, I'm going to preface this, and the reason why I am is because I know the reaction that I'm going to get from this. I've done Joe Bonanno before. That episode really cannot be heard anywhere. But what I want to get out there is, because people are going to take from this whatever they want. I am not a fan of Joe Bonanno. That doesn't mean when I sit down to do these things that I already have that sort of going on in my mind, so I'm just going to trash the guy. That's not the way this is. Historically, a lot of people look at Joe Bonanno as he was a king and highly intelligent, et cetera, but it's sort of what Joe Bonanno did to the mob. He was very catastrophic in a lot of different ways for the mob. Was greedy, was pompous, definitely egotistical, couldn't tell the truth, wrote a book, a tell-all. So the perspective I'm trying to get out is that we talk about him historically. Sure, we're going to cover from A to Z, cover all the bases, and etc. But the one thing that people may not realize is that Joe Bonanno, for the most part, past 1957, really was a nobody in the mob. He got shelved. The commission seat got taken from him because of the way he acted. So there's a lot of things that people may not know. But looking back historically, he's not going to be really, at the end of the day, when history looks back, they're always going to put Joe Bonanno on a cover because that's just the reality. But the reality actually behind the wall, behind the veil of the curtain, is that Joe Bonanno was really not a top-tier boss. And there's a lot of reasons why. Maybe in his early days, absolutely. But the minute you write a tell-all book, the minute you distort reality and try to change reality, the minute you say you never sold narcotics and you did, that's where you made your fortune. There's just a lot of things that Joe Bonanno did that were absolutely reckless, and he's totally lucky that he wasn't killed because there was a time when the commission wanted his head on a platter, and we're going to get into all of those details. So before anybody sort of comes back at me with this whole thing of how dare you say this and say that, if you don't believe me, read it for yourself, which leads me to the second thing. The second thing is listen, when I do research, it comes from obviously sources, it comes from case files and stuff like that. I continuously get messages with people who obviously don't listen to my show, or they listen to 2 minutes of it, and they take umbrance with something that I say because they think they know better. Not that somebody doesn't know better, but at the end of the day, if you are going to message me and try to have a debate with me on a fact here or there, it might serve you a purpose to actually listen to the fucking show and hear what I say, because I can't tell you how many times I get emails where people say I said something and I really didn't. They just hear what they want to hear. So everybody's a fucking expert. That's sort of the way it goes. I don't have a problem with that. I'm just glad people listen at the end of the day. But if you're going to message me looking for a debate, you're not going to get it, because I'm going to say the same thing I'm going to say right now. Everything I do is factual. Everything I do can be backed up with files, court records, etc. These are not facts that come from informants. There's a lot of people out there, especially on Facebook, that take the words of informants as fucking gospel. And the truth is, they're liars. They're scumbags. They're the bottom cellar dwellers. They're slime. And I have no respect for them, which leads me to point 3. Somebody recently messaged me if I would do a show on Michael Franchese. I refuse to. I will not. I have been on the record as to why I won't. People consistently keep trying to tell me that he bought his way out of the mob. He didn't. He's a fucking rat. Norby Walters he ratted on. He ratted on a lowly janitor. Both of those guys did close to 10 years combined in prison. He made guys names to the FBI. So don't come at me and tell me that Michael Franchese is somehow this miraculous deity on earth at this point that never gave anybody up, because he did, and that's the reality. He doesn't like to talk about that, but that's true. If you don't believe me, there was a Variety magazine article, I believe. I don't know what the date was, but if anybody contacts me, I'll definitely find the link and send it to you, where he admits to doing all those things. So he can go on all these shows and sit and talk about how he was so smart and how he out-clevered everyone, but the reality is he told on people. That's why he got a reduced sentence. That's why he signed a cooperation deal. When you sign a cooperation deal, that means you're a fucking rat. Not that, you just bought your way out. So stop believing the hype, and that's why I will not cover him on any capacity on the show. Now, brings me to the fourth point, is that people continuously ask me, why don't I interview somebody like Frank Ganji, Jimmy Calandra, and some of these other guys that are informants? I don't do that. I've done that in the past. And one of the problems that you have when you do this is that, first of all, these guys aren't honest. Second of all, they always try to make themselves out to be something that they're not. Everybody knows, for the record, the person that I interviewed first, and that person proved to be a huge liar, and that's the reality of it. Are there less liars than truth tellers? Most of the time. Some of these guys tell the truth, but for the most part, what I have found is they all consistently lie nonstop. They all try to make themselves out to be something that they weren't. Your Frank Coladas. I don't want anything to do with those guys, not because they're not valid in some sense of the imagination, because who wouldn't want to hear like an inside story about Tony Spilatro? I know I would. However, the problem is the person that's telling the story lies, and I don't want to reproduce that. There are other mob shows that will gladly do that. I'm just not going to be one. I'm not going to say that I'm never going to go back on that rule, because there is maybe one person I would like to talk to that the situation's a little different. But if you're looking to come to my show, you want to hear like stories from a Frank Culata, your John A. Lights, or whoever else, you're not going to hear it on my show. I'm just not going to give them a venue. I'm not going to give them an outlet, and that's just the bottom line. If you don't like it, I'm sorry, but you can find another show that will do that, which brings me to, like, I don't know how many points I'm up to, 6 at this point. As far as the threats and stuff that I do get, I really don't care. It doesn't intimidate me, doesn't scare me. However, the one thing that I want to make perfectly crystal clear, I'm a radio show host, okay? I don't know what people say in these little gossip groups that they have, because there's a lot of that going on, but I know nobody's saying it to me. There's a lot of rumors out there about who I am, what I do, this, that, and the third. Those are all bullshit rumors. Obviously, nobody bothers to ask me. They just sit in the little websites and the little chat rooms like a bunch of little girls and talk shit, and that's what they do. But for the record, I don't, and this is sort of part of it, when people message me, they ask me personal stuff about people I know. I'm not going to divulge that. I never have. I never will. Those are my friends, people I care about. And that's not for public consumption. So when I get questions like that, if I'm rude, it's only because I'm just not going to answer the question. All of that being said, we need to get to shows today because we got a lot to do. As far as mob news, there's nothing going on. Toto Riina died in Italy. We covered that over on Mob Talk blog, which you can check out by There's a bunch of links and stuff on Facebook. So anyway, when we come back, we're going to get to Joe Bonanno. And then once this show is over, I'll release a secondary show, which is going to be Joey Messino. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. Hey, welcome back to Mob Talk Radio. We are talking about Joe Bonanno in the first show today. The second show is going to be Joey Messino, so let's just dive right into it. Giuseppe Carlo Bonnano was born in 1905 in Castellamare del Golfo, Sicily. When he was 3 years old, his family immigrated to New York City, Williamsburg to be precise, but they only stayed for about 10 years before they returned to Italy. However, in 1924, Joe Bonanno would actually return to the United States, specifically New York City. And Bonnano essentially hid away on a Cuban fishing boat bound for Florida. But going back to the days in Italy, he actually was involved in the mafia prior to coming back. But as a result of Benito Mussolini cracking down on the mafia and communism, he sort of kind of left. At least that's what he says according to his lie-filled book, which I'm going to get to later. For anybody that does go out and get that book, Bound by Honor, or whatever the hell, Bound by Honor, it's a complete farce, a complete joke, filled with lies, and sort of takes the mob and makes it like the Godfather movie. It's creepy. But anyway, I don't want to get off on that right at the second. Anyway, he arrives back in New York, and he begins bootlegging, and he actually ends up joining the Maranzano crime family. A couple years later, the Castellamare War starts, and as Bonnano joined the Maranzano crime family, Maranzano sort of recognizes what he has in Bonnano, and Bonnano has insane organizational skills. He has a penchant for violence, but really what his bread and butter is organizing. He was always good at definitely organizing. Excuse me. In 1927, violence breaks out between Maranzano and Masseria, which would end up being called the Castellamare War. For 4 years, it was an all-out war. The guys traded shots at each other left and right, but by 1930, Maranzano's chief aides, besides Joe Bonanno, were Tommy Lucchese, Joe Magliocco, and Tommy Gagliano. On the other side of the fence, you had Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, Joe Adonis, Carlo Gambino, Stefano Magaddino, Albert Anastasia, and Frank Costello. So the who's who of mob lore was in on this. A third faction, which when I say a third faction, technically it's really not a third faction. It was, you had Maranzano's people, you had Masseria's people, but then sort of when I say a third faction, I mean couple of guys from both sides ended up sort of starting their own thing, but they slowly emerged, and it was mainly composed of younger mobsters. They ended up being called the Turks or the Young Turks, and it was comprised of Luciano, Castello, Genovese, Gambino, Anastasia, and then soon after, Lucchese, Magliocco, and others joined as well. In 1931, momentum had begun to really shift towards Maranzano, and the reason why is they had bigger numbers, they were a little stronger, and they were highly organized. Not that Masseria couldn't keep up, But the problem is that Massaria's side of the fence sort of began to see what was going on between Maranzano and Massaria, and they sort of got jaded by the whole entire thing. And what ends up happening is a bunch of Massaria's men sort of begin to defect. Not that they essentially went over to the Maranzano side. They just sort of got out of it because it wasn't worth it. And they sort of saw what was coming ahead of the game. But at any rate, Lucky Luciano and Vito Genovese went to Massaria and said, listen, we got to make peace. We've got to end this. It's got to stop. Massaria refused. Luciano and Genovese then realized that there was really only one way to end the problem. So what essentially they did was they held a secret meeting with Maranzano, and they essentially said, listen, we will kill Joe the Boss Massaria. In exchange, we want equal status in your crime family. Meaning, if we agree to join your side and we take out Joe Massaria, Lucky Luciano wants to be a boss. Vito Genovese wants to be a boss. And that seemed to sort of be the agreement. And so anyhow, Massaria ends up getting killed, but then Maranzano effectively names himself boss of bosses, which is not what they agreed to. It was his ego, it was his pomp, and Luciano and Genovese kind of look at each other and say, here we are, we went and did a favor. This guy now wants to be the leader of everybody, when in fact the agreement was at least that Luciano on paper would be elevated to at least be equal with Maranzano. But as a result, Luciano ultimately would have Maranzano killed, and as a result of that, Joe Bonanno would be given what was left of Maranzano's crime family. Also, in Bonanno's biography, he claimed he didn't know of the plot against Maranzano, but the reality is he did. He had everything to gain by Massaria going, he had everything to gain by Maranzano going, and chances are he was probably promised that if he went along with what was going on, he was going to get his own family. So the idea that he says in his bullshit biography that I knew nothing of what was happening is bullshit. He had to have known. He would have been in on it. And the truth is that had he not been on it, he likely would have been killed because they weren't going to leave any loose strings. If he had argued back that it was the wrong thing to do, then he would have been killed. And so that also kind of contradicts his book as far as him discussing how mob bosses were killing other mob bosses, how he would never have a hand in that. But that's also bullshit because he repeatedly tried to kill Carlo Gambino. So the idea that this biography or this autobiography is accurate is absolute bullshit. I have read it. It's laughable at best, but like I said, it's up for you to decide. I think it's called Bound by Honor, the Joe Bonanno story, which is it's pretty hysterical read actually. But in no doubt, did Bonnano not know what was going to happen to Maranzano? He was in on it, and the proof is he prospered from it. So the idea he didn't know and wasn't in on it, come on, get real. So moving right along, historically during this time, the Bonannos were a powerhouse. Loan sharking, bookmaking, numbers rackets, prostitution, drug trafficking made the Bonnano crime family insanely wealthy at this time. But because, he had an influx of cash, what Bonnano starts to do is he starts to invest money in high-profit real estate, and he does this in the Great Depression, which is highly intelligent, highly risky. But what he did was he took profits from all the illegal stuff he had, starts buying high profitable real estate, and he even starts to get into legitimate businesses such as 3 coat factories, one which were in the garment district. He bought cheese factories, funerals, and even a trucking company. And a side note to that, the funeral homes, specifically one in Brooklyn that he did own, he subcontracted out to all the other mob families so that they could dispose of bodies. If you've ever heard of the phrase double-decker coffin, there's a reason for it, because what they would essentially do is if somebody had to go, they would have a coffin that would have 2 levels. On the bottom was the stiff they whacked, on the top was somebody else, so they were burying essentially 2 people for one. and anybody that got associated with Bonnano to the extent of in the funeral business knew that when they went to him, they were going to be provided with double-decker coffins. And even by 1954, Joe Bonanno was a multimillionaire. Now, if you do the math on 1945, I think I said 54, but I meant 45, a multimillionaire is absolutely insane. But like I said, a lot of this had to do with the rackets, and then he was smart enough to take his rackets and dump it into legitimate businesses, which seemed to be sort of the mold that a lot of these guys did. The only time prior to Appalachian, of course, that Joe Bonanno ever had any trouble with the law was when one of his clothing factories was investigated by the government for violating federal minimum wage and hour laws. He essentially was underpaying people. He ended up getting caught, was fined $50, which wasn't a big deal for him at that point, but the problem was it brought a little of attention to him, and then later on down the line, Bonanno gets arrested for lying on his citizen's application for concealing a criminal record, which the criminal charge that he had was larceny. In 1957, Joe Bonanno attends the ill-fated Appalachian meeting called by Vito Genovese. And the reason why Vito Genovese calls this meeting is, one, he wants everybody to kiss his ass, and he wants everybody to recognize him as boss. That was his real issue. He wanted to be recognized by the commission. He wanted to be recognized by his peers. Why that's the case, I will never know. I always think it's better just to be calm, cool, and collected. But he wanted to be recognized, and more specifically, he wanted to discuss drugs and narcotics. Vito Genovese had no problem moving narcotics. That would eventually be his undoing, but that was really what the meeting was to be about. It was about to be about business, about narcotics trafficking, but most importantly, Genovese really wanted to get recognized as a mob boss. Anyhow, Joe Bonanno long denied, especially in his book, that he was ever at Appalachian. But the truth is, he was actually arrested in a cornfield a few miles from Barboza's house. So he says in his book that he effectively wasn't at Appalachian. He would never go to a meeting where criminals met because it was too much heat. Yet the truth is, he was arrested and caught hiding in a cornfield just miles away from the house. So once again, we see that Joe Bonanno isn't really telling the truth when history and facts and documents present otherwise. So he ends up being indicted for obstruction of justice after refusing to answer questions. And the reason why he's arrested is because once Appalachian happened and everybody got arrested, everybody got indicted, and then Joe Valachi comes forward and starts ratting everybody out, effectively, then they started sequestering all of these guys. You know, obviously they know what the mob is to some extent at this point, and they end up wanting to ask Bonanno questions, and he just simply says, fuck off, I'm not going to answer them. And before he's scheduled to go to trial, he has a heart attack. Now, from my records, he did not have a heart attack. It was faked so that he could avoid answering any questions, which we've seen before. Carlo Gambino was very good at doing that. But because of his heart attack, they effectively removed him from trial, and the indictment ends up getting tossed out. So, fakes the heart attack, gets away with it, and just continues to go about his business. By the mid-1950s, the commission begins to have internal issues. The biggest issue, obviously, was Vito Genovese and Frank Costello at the time were fighting for control of the Luciano crime family. In 1951, Mangano disappears. In 1957, Albert Anastasia is killed. Then Appalachian happens. Then in 1963, Joe Valachi, who was a soldier in the Genovese crime family, ends up giving up the entire mob, the structure, the name of bosses, rackets. And also during this time, Bonanno also arranges the marriage of his son Bill to Rosalie Profaci, which brings business between the Profaci crime family and the Bonannos together. Now, the reason why I mentioned all of those things is because the commission was having a very big issue, because all of these things relatively happened in a 10-year period, so there was a lot of going on and a lot of different power struggles going on at the time. So with Joe Bonanno arranging the marriage of his son Bill, whose real name was Salvatore, to Rosalie Profaci, it brings the family together and makes them strong. The Profacis still sort of ran on their own for the most part, but they were a little bit more beholden to the Bonnano crime family than they probably should have been, and that sort of caused a little bit of panic and some wide eyes as that happened. Essentially, okay, here we go. Joe Magliocco would end up taking over the Profacis because a couple of months, or I think a year after Rosalie Profaci and Bill Bonnano married, Joe Profaci dies. And essentially, Joe Magliocco ends up taking over the Profacis. The problem is that Magliocco was having huge issues with Joey Gallo at the time, who was, and Joey Gallo, obviously, of course, was backed by Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese. Now, we've talked repeatedly about what the issues were with Joey Gallo and a number of different people, but rather than go through all of that again, you can go back to some of my earlier shows, like the show of Frank Costello, Joe Colombo, and you can kind of see what Gallo's issues were. But the reason why Gambino and Lucchese back him is because Joe Magliocco was considered to be almost a fucking clone of Joe Profaci, and they wanted change, and they wanted Joe Profaci was a penny pincher, the old phrase being that, you pinch the quarter till the eagle screams kind of a guy, and they wanted some change, and they didn't like the fact that Magliocco was so close to Bonnano. Maybe they were clairvoyant to some extent, but they sort of saw that as being a problem down the line, and they were absolutely fucking right in that assertion. So, essentially, what ends up happening when Gambino and Lucchese back Joey Gallo is Joe Bonanno feels threatened, and he begins to plot for the death of both Gambino and Lucchese, as well as Stefano Magaddino, who was actually his cousin, Frank DeSimone, and so now there's a problem. What essentially is happening here is Joe Bonanno's realizing that Gambino is very powerful, Lucchese's very powerful, and if Bonnano ultimately gets what he wants, which he wants to be the boss of all bosses, he's got to start killing people. The fact that Gambino and Lucchese did not support Magliocco, who he did, it just caused a beef. And so essentially, the minute that Gambino and Lucchese say, we're gonna back Joe Gallo, Bonnano starts to get scared. And he orders the death, effectively, of Carlo Gambino, Tommy Lucchese, Stefano Magaddino, who at the time was the Buffalo crime boss, Frank DeSimone, who was the boss of Los Angeles, and Magliocco essentially gives the murder contract to Joe Colombo. They went to him, so you take care of us, take care of this for us, and everything great. I would almost assume that Joe Colombo was probably offered a great deal of money, a great deal of the rackets. Probably not rackets now that I realistically think about it, because Joe Bonanno was not much of a sharer when it came to that. However, there's a problem. Joe Colombo doesn't really like Joe Bonanno, doesn't really trust Joe Bonanno. So what he does is he goes back to Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese and tells them that Magliocco came to them on orders from Bonnano to kill everybody. So now there's a problem. So Gambino and Tommy Lucchese end up calling an emergency commission meeting. They effectively order Magliocco and Joe Bonanno to appear. Joe Bonanno refuses to even show up. However, Magliocco does show up, does confess to the plot, and because he's honest and because he's old and in failing health, the commission says, you know what, we're not going to kill you. You're going to pay a fine of $43,000. You're done in the mob, and we're going to take effectively we're going to take the crime family and hand it to Joe Colombo. And that was pretty much a reward for Joe Colombo being upfront and honest about what was going on. Magliocco would die pretty much soon after that. And also at that point, they were sort of willing to let Joe Bonanno just kind of walk from this. They probably would have ended up fining him at some point and giving him a bunch of shit right on the riot act. And he would have gotten off relatively light. But the fact that he refused to be a man about it, the fact that he refused to answer the charges, infuriated the commission, infuriated Gambino, infuriated everybody in the mob. That's when they sort of kind of realized that Magliocco really wasn't the guy behind it, because the guy that's behind it isn't necessarily going to step up. He's going to admit to, this was brought to me, I was supposed to handle it. They start to figure out that Joe Bonanno really was the guy who was behind the idea, and now they have a super fucking big problem. By this point, Joe Bonanno's having other problems as well. He's not respected by the other bosses. Stefano Magaddino, who was his first cousin, was absolutely furious that Joe Bonanno starts encroaching into Toronto, Canada, which had long been Buffalo territory. It was Magaddino's territory. Bonnano was also spending most of his time outside of New York, between Canada, Arizona, California, and he always seemed to be missing when the crime family needed him most. They're taking orders from a guy who's never in the state, never in the city. So after several months of Joe Bonanno refusing to talk to the commission, refusing to send a message, the commission effectively removed him as boss and handed the family to Gaspar de Gregorio. De Gregorio, my bad. So they hand the family over, which infuriates Bonnano. He does not want to accept it. He refuses to accept it. And the result is that the family effectively splits into two factions. On one side was represented by Joe Bonanno and his son Bill, and the other side was represented by Gaspare de Gregorio. So now they have a problem. The family has effectively splintered. And in 1964, Joe Bonanno disappears and is not seen or heard from for 2 years. It had long been the claim that Joe Bonanno was kidnapped in front of his attorney's office by members of the Buffalo crime family, that being Peter Magaddino and Antonio Magaddino, his cousins. He ended up telling people that he was held captive in upstate New York by Stefano Magaddino. Supposedly, Magaddino represented the commission Supposedly, according to Buffalino, Magaddino was representing the commission by kidnapping him. That's a bold-faced lie. After 6 weeks, he was actually released and fled to Texas. Remember, this is everything according to Joe Bonanno, which have been proven to be all lies. And two things back up the fact that these are lies. There was a New Jersey wiretap of Sam DeCavalcante, and it was intercepted by the FBI, and it was him and other people were discussing how shocked they were that Joe Bonanno left. He vanished. They were worried. They didn't know where he was because it was no act by the commission. Nobody ordered it, so they were all kind of confused and didn't exactly know what was going on. There were other FBI recordings that were picked up by Bonnano's own soldiers and men, also saying they had no idea where we went, and they were complaining that he had effectively deserted them like a coward. The truth is that Joe Bonanno took off out of fear. He was scared he was going to be killed. He did not want to stand in the light at all because it represented the fact that he could get killed. He would rather put his son out front and let him deal with whatever needed to happen. But the fact is nobody kidnapped Joe Bonanno. Joe Bonanno took off, and it also, there was also something else. He was supposed to go on trial. He was supposed to appear at a grand jury, like literally one day before this happens, and he disappears. So it's not impossible to say that he took off because he didn't want to deal with the grand jury indictment. I don't blame him for that. But the other thing was he took off because he was scared shitless of the other families, because at this point, after everything he had done, the commission effectively puts a price on his head. His own men are tired of him. The war between the two factions is still going on. Bonnano was very stretched thin, in every imaginable way he was stretched thin. He didn't have much support left. Adding to that was U.S. Attorney Robert Morgenthau, was pretty much breathing down his neck. Obviously he gets served with a subpoena to testify before a grand jury investigating organized crime. And the first round, effectively, of questioning was supposed to begin the day before he vanished or the day that he did vanish. It's either before or the day of. But those are the reasons why he took off. In May of 1966 in Foley Square, Bonnano magically reappears in New York City. He ends up getting indicted for failing to appear at the grand jury, but would end up fighting that charge for 5 years. Ultimately, it gets dismissed in 1971. But as Bonnano comes back, he's still not letting go of the fight. He doesn't agree with the commission. He doesn't think it's right. The family's his. It belongs to him. So he's still refusing to accept what the commission has said. So what Bonnano begins to do is he begins to rally several members of the crime family. He tries to rubbing elbows. You should come back. This will work out better. I'm the boss. It's my family. Things will go a lot better if we do it this way. But he was able to attain a bunch of different people, but ultimately at the end of the day it wasn't enough to sort of change what was going on, and there was still a split between the family and two factions. In 1966 at a Brooklyn sit-down, Di Gregorio's men arrived, and as Bill Bonnano arrives, there's a gun battle. Di Gregorio had tried essentially killing everybody at that point. There's nothing worth talking about. Violence is going to be the way to solve this, but ultimately at the end of the day, it really wouldn't solve anything. It would create more problems, but there was violence, there were murders, and ultimately the commission sort of gets tired of seeing what's going on, and they end up placing Di Gregorio with Paul Sciacca. But the war would just continue, so it didn't matter who the commission added at that point. Bill Bonnano, Joe's son, was going to fight the war. Joe Bonanno was going to fight the war. But what's interesting is that Bill Bonnano stepped out front. Joe stayed behind, sort of in the closet, as it were, and wasn't really seen a whole lot. But the battle raged on. The war effectively ends when Joe Bonanno suffers an actual real heart attack while he was in hiding. Because while the war was going on, he took off to upstate New York, hid out in a cabin, moved to Arizona, did a lot of different things. He didn't want to be in New York while this was going on, which I think is sort of a cowardly act. I think if you're going to... You put your son out in front like that. To me, that's a little disturbing. I don't think a man does that. I think a coward does that. It's your crime family. You're the one that wants it. Why are you going to put your son in harm's way? It just doesn't make any sense to me. I don't have respect for a guy like that, but that's me. Anyway, he's forced into retirement after he suffers a heart attack in 1968, and this is what happens from here. He was commissioned that effectively you can retire, but if you ever get involved with crime in New York or the mafia in general ever again, or if you get involved in any of our affairs, we will fucking kill you. That was what he was told. Get the fuck out of New York, go wherever you want to go, but if you get involved in any organized crime business here, you get involved in the mafia anywhere else, you will fucking die. That is what's going to happen to you. As a result of that bullshit, they ended up ripping a commission seat. The Bonannos were no longer going to be able to represent themselves in the commission. They had had enough from him, and to this day, and we'll find out when we do our second show today with Joey Massino, that Joey Massino at one point had gone and begged John Gotti to help him get a seat on the commission again. And Vinny the Chin would have nothing to do with it. Absolutely not. This is the way it is, and that's the end of it. You're being penalized for something Joe Bonanno did. That's the bottom line. And that would create friction between Vinny Gigante, Joey Massino, and John Gotti. But we'll get to that show. But since that day, the Bonanno crime family has never had a seat on the commission ever again. So effectively, Joe Bonanno is told he's going to be killed if he fucks around anymore. Effectively, their leadership was done. They were going to bring in new people. So he effectively was shelved and completely erased from the mafia at that point. Natalie Joe Diamond Zivola ends up taking over the family, but he would die soon after. Then after Joe Diamond Zivola takes over, he dies, and then Philip Rastelli would end up taking over the crime family. Now, the second part of the show, we're going to talk more in depth about Philip Rastelli because obviously he was the boss while Joey Massino was starting to bump and grind and do his thing. So we're going to see how that. So this is a good pathway to the next show. So Joe Bonanno ends up taking off and living in Arizona. In the 70s, Bill and Joe Jr., his children, sort of began to have problems, and they bring problems to the mob once again by creating headlines, which is what the mob didn't want. And this takes place in Northern California. They effectively got involved with Lou Peters, who was a Cadillac and Oldsmobile dealer. And mainly this guy owned dealerships in San Jose, Lodi, and Stockton, California. And what ended up happening was Bonnano had laundered a ton of money into legitimate businesses, but he still had a lot of money that he wanted to sort of wash. And so in 1977, Bill approaches Peters with an offer to buy him out for $2 million. The dealership at the time was valued at $1.2 million. They had planned to buy 13 Central Valley dealerships and launder mob money. They were still bookmaking, still racketeering in Arizona and in California, which created huge problems with the mob. I'm not exactly... I think probably the reason why Joe Bonanno even survived his sons and him getting caught up in this bullshit in California was the fact that Carlo Gambino was dead. I think had Carlo Gambino still been alive, Joe Bonanno would have been killed. I think they were that upset, and the old guard at that point was effectively pretty much gone, with the exception of Vincent Gigante had stepped into the scene at that point. And maybe at that point they figured, he's fucking 80 years old. What's the point? They're going to all do jail time over this anyway. It's their fucking problem. But I'm sure that it upset the apple cart in many ways. Why they never went after him, I'm not really sure. But I think it probably had more to do with he's a fucking nobody at this point. Who cares? But anyway, they really tried to monopolize on these Central Valley dealerships. But ultimately, what the plan was is they were going to buy 13 of the dealerships, and that this guy, Lou Peters, was effectively going to be their front man. He would take care of everything, help launder the money, but he would be the front man. And instead, what Peters ends up doing is he goes to the FBI and rats them out. Why he chose to do that, I don't think anybody will really know. I don't think it was ever clear as to why he did that. Probably realistically because he was being forced to sell his dealerships. I don't think this was something he wanted to do. I think Bill Bonnano leaned on him. I think Joe Bonanno used his name to lean on him. And at the time, that was a big name, and it probably instilled a lot of fear. But the reality is they had nobody. They had no backing from the commission, no backing from the mob, nothing. They were acting sort of as individuals at that point. They end up getting caught, and for the first time, Joe Bonanno ends up getting arrested, convicted, and would serve 5 years in prison, and that was at age 75. In 1983, and by the way, Bill Bonnano would go to prison as well, but then after he gets out of prison the first time, Bill Bonnano ends up ripping off a bunch of senior citizens in a senior citizens home, bilking them of all their money. So, that's a scumbag move too. But the reality is they're criminals, and that's what they're going to do. So in 1983, he ends up publishing a book called A Man of Honor. And as a result, the government ended up getting a little bit curious about the situation, and they want to question Joe Bonanno about the mob, and he absolutely refuses to answer questions. And that further infuriates the New York Mafia, because this was a boss who was writing a book about his life in the mob. But the bigger issue really wasn't necessarily that he was writing about the mob. It's the fact that he admitted that there was a commission, a ruling panel of mobsters. That fucking infuriated Paul Castellano and infuriated Vincent Gigante. It infuriated everybody at the top of the chain. Why that didn't get him killed is beyond my understanding, too, because that's the one thing that really infuriated them. In fact, when we get to Joey Massino, you're going to hear a story about how Joey Massino hated Joe Bonanno so fucking much because of that book he wrote. He wanted to change the name from the Bonanno crime family to the Massino crime family. And I, frankly, would have been fine with that. Because I think that if you're going to change it, carry on a name and have a legacy, it shouldn't be for a guy that talks. And unfortunately, it's still that way, but then Joe Bonanno follows that bullshit up with a 60-minute interview where he talks about how he never sold narcotics, never did anything wrong. He's full of shit, and you can look right through it. Then they interview his son, who just spews garbage as well. They were looking to cash in on this fairy tale, and then came a TV movie after that. And eventually Joe Bonanno ends up dying at 97 years old in 2002. His son Bill would die not 2 years later of a massive heart attack. And that effectively ended Joe Bonanno. Now, for a lot of people that were looking for little intricate details of things that he did, I could have done it that way. There's a little more facts that I could have included, but you got to understand, I got 2 shows to do today, so I'm trying to get to the root of everything. But the biggest thing and the biggest narrative that I wanted to get to was what Joe Bonanno did at the end of his career. We can argue that he was smart in terms of business, smart in terms of how he operated his crime family, but at the same time, I hope that what you did get out of this is showing you how selfish and greedy he was. It was all about him. And then he comes out with this book, and he talks about in the book that the mafia wasn't an organized crime group, that the mafia was a conglomerate of wealthy Italian friends who wanted to dress nice, drink the finest wine, eat the finest food, and to change society into making it a better place. Now, I don't know what kind of bullshit he was trying to feed people, but that's the stupidest fucking thing I've ever heard. And I've heard a lot of stupid shit. He denied that narcotics he was ever involved in, when the truth is he was one of the biggest narcotics distributors in Cosa Nostra. He had inroads to Canada and to the Rizzutos. He had inroads to Montreal, inroads to Corsica, the poppy fields. I mean, this is a guy that sold narcotics at a massive fucking level. So the idea that he never did that, he also said he never killed anybody. That's laughable as shit, which I understand. You're going to deny certain things. When you're 90-some fucking years old, what does it matter at that point? But the problem is he wrote a book, and he told a lot of lies. He sort of took his life and made it into some retarded tapestry of an opera. And that's not the reality of it. The reality is he had a bunch of people killed. He ran his crime family somewhat ruthlessly. But his own ideals and his own ego and his own bravado got in the way of him being what he should have been, which is a shut the fuck up, do your business, make your money, and let your crime family continue to profit. And he wasn't able to do that because he felt like everybody should kiss his ass, that he was the top of the top. And the truth is he wasn't. And I hope that you got that from this show. And it wasn't, I'm not trying to dog the guy too much, but the reality is like, if you put a silk head on a pig, it's still a pig. I've said that on this show I don't know how many times. He was not some masterful, super clever, money-making machine. He was profitable, absolutely. But the reality of who he was, he wanted to bark about later on down the road. He talked about Paul Castellano, what happened to him, and how it was so disgraceful. Fuck you. You tried to kill Carlo Gambino yourself, you prick. You tried to kill Tommy Lucchese. You tried to kill Stefano Magaddino, your first cousin, out of jealousy. You tried to kill Frank DeSimone in L.A. You wanted to take out the whole entire commission because you wanted to be boss. So the only reason why it didn't happen is because Joe Colombo said, "No, I'm not getting involved in this shit. I see where this is going." And he lets his friends know, hey, this guy's talking subversive. He wants to get you killed. That in and of itself should have gotten fucking Joe Bonanno killed. That in and of itself. So he can have his little fantasy book that he never did these things, but that's reality. That's the reality of the situation. And I've said this time and time again because we have this argument, and I know people are rolling their eyes now. But stop believing the hype that killing a boss is somehow some kind of stretch of imaginary things that don't happen and how there's a secret rule and nobody better do it. Bullshit. It's been going on since the 20s. That's the way it's always been. Maranzano is killed. Masseria gets killed. Anastasia is killed. Do I need to keep going? Philip Testa is killed. Angelo Bruno is killed. How many times? Castellano gets killed. How many times do I have to say it? That's been a part of the mafia since the fucking very beginning of the day. So the idea that what Joe Bonanno did was any different than anybody before him? No, it's not really different. He just didn't succeed. But that should have gotten him killed. Just the idea of it, if we're going to go on the basic principle of it, because we're not talking one, we're talking like 5 guys, 5 top guys he wanted to kill. That should have gotten him killed. Then he doesn't show up at the commission meeting, refuses to deal with them. I'm not going to accept what you guys say, you're nothing. That should have gotten him killed. Then he writes a fucking autobiography. That should have gotten him killed. They warned him to stay away from mob rackets, mob-controlled areas, stay out of Vegas, stay out of L.A., stay out of everything, just fucking retire and shut up. He didn't do it. That should have gotten him killed. Does a TV movie. That should have gotten him killed. So the idea that in his book he talks about living a long and enduring life and how the reason why he's lived a long and enduring life is because he was sneaky and he was covert and he was more intelligent than anyone around him is absolute bullshit. It came down to luck. It came down to the fact that in 77 when he started this dumb shit that Carlo Gambino was dead, who would have surely had him killed immediately. Because it was Gambino was the one, along with the commission, that said, you're fucking done. You're done. You will be murdered if this happens. And who knows, maybe Vinny Gigante did not really want to get involved in that at that point. Because at that point, he's 75 years old, what the fuck's he going to do? You know, I don't think that they expected him to live to be into his 90s, obviously. Does a 60 Minutes interview. Should have been killed. That's the reality. So, even going back to the early days, right? Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, the Young Turks. Bonnano was only involved in that because he was getting something out of it. He was fully aware that Maranzano and Masseria would be killed, and he was in on it because he was profiting from it. So don't believe the hype that these guys don't do shit to make themselves profitable. If it's good for them, it's good for them. Because if Bonnano had bucked back in those days, they would have killed him then. You know? And I think that he was trusted in the early days, but once they started seeing that he was more interested in narcotics trafficking, he was more interested in making himself rich, the fact that he was putting his son out in front when shots were going off. How many other mob bosses you know have done that? Put their fucking children on the front line. Let their children get shot at. Name one. Name one. I'll be waiting for that answer forever because it's not going to happen. He's the only sick fuck that would do that. Meanwhile, he's vacationing in Acapulco, and his son Bill's getting shot at, who obviously didn't have any kind of fucking mob acumen at all. He was put there to protect what was his father's. Bill was not a highly smart individual at all. He wasn't even really a thug. He sort of reminds me of Paul Castellano, but I think Paul Castellano was even tougher than Bill Bonnano was. So, before you accost me and come at me with you just don't like him, you're saying all kinds of crazy shit. You're right, I don't like him. I never have. I've never had any respect for him. And anybody that tells me when I talk about this subject what a great guy he was, you know what, I'm sure that everybody in this world is a great guy to some extent. But I'm a firm believer in old school shit. You're put in a position for reasons. And you don't talk. And this guy talked repeatedly. Then he wanted to buck the system and wanted to go to war with everybody because he couldn't deal with something that they said he needed to do because he was above it all. It's bullshit. That's not what Lucky Luciano set this up for. That wasn't his design. But the fact that Bonnano wanted to do what he wanted to do, he should have been killed. He should have been killed. And as we look back on the top 10 mob bosses of all time, he's not even on my top 50 at this point. He never really has been. Because I think there are other people. I'm more of a fan of old school guys. You know, they have their rackets. They do what they got to do. They don't need to talk. They definitely wouldn't put their children out in front of any danger whatsoever. They sure as hell wouldn't buck the commission and say, fuck off, I'm doing what I want. So it has nothing to do with his charm or his high intelligence or his sneakiness. The motherfucker got lucky. That's it. That's the reality. Somebody got lazy, said, I don't want to fuck with this guy no more, whatever. Otherwise, he'd have been splayed out all over the fucking cement, him and his son both, for what they did. So, a man of honor? Absolutely not. He was a coward. And that's the truth. An honorable man does the right thing. A coward hides. And that's what he did. He effectively hid for years and years and years. So, you know where to send your death threats, your I hate yous, because I know I'm going to get them after this. But that's the reality. I call a spade a spade. I will always tell the truth. I will always give you my opinion. And it's simply that, just my opinion. If you don't like it, turn the fucking dial. I don't care. But that's my opinion, and I base that opinion based on a schematic or a character of what a mobster should be, at least in my eyes. You may think differently. You may think he was a genius and a great guy, and the commission was totally wrong to go after him. But when you've been in this genre as long as I have, you've been around enough people, you've experienced things yourself, you sort of see how the politics work and how things fucking operate. And believe me, there are guys in that lifestyle that were killed for a hell of a lot less than that situation. So that was the story of Joe Bonanno. I wanted to thank everybody for listening in. We got Joey Messino coming up next. It will be put on YouTube as a secondary radio show. I thank you for listening. You can follow us on Twitter at Real Mob Talk 7, Mob Talk Radio blog, True Crime blog. The link is on our Facebook page, which you can find when you type that into the search bar. Also, Mob Talk Radio is on Facebook. You can like us, subscribe, send death threats, hate, email, all the stuff we get. So I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope you learned something about the hierarchy and sort of the politics of it. And I think you're really going to enjoy the next show because it's a very in-depth, big show. So we'll see everybody later on. Enjoy the second show with Joey Messino. Hope everybody had a great Thanksgiving.